Hello everyone, welcome back to another guide. Today we're going to be talking about Frost Mage in a Mythic Plus environment. And let's just hop right into it. So today for Frost, there's a couple things that we're going to be talking about. Talents, secondary stats, Azerite traits, general tips, macros. Just like every other video that I do, I'm going to try and keep it concise, as Frost Mage is pretty simple, if I'm going to be honest, in Mythic Plus. There's some things that you can do to increase your damage, but I don't know, it's pretty straightforward. So let's just jump into it. So for the first tier of talents, you're going to take Bone Chilling. These other two aren't really worth taking. Lonely Winter maybe in the future when we get better secondary stats, but that's up to simming. And for Mythic Plus, you really want the Pet Freeze ability, and we'll talk about that in a bit. Next tier is going to be Shimmer. Shimmer's great. Blink while casting, makes Blink OP. And then for the next tier, we've got Incanter's Flow is going to be the one you want to take. A lot of people say that Rune of Power is insane, and I would be one of those people that says Rune of Power is insane. But for Frost Mage, there's no real place you can use Rune of Power unless you're like trying to solely focus on AoE. But that's not what dungeons are. Dungeons are AoE and a lot of single target, especially on Tyrannical Week. So Incanter's Flow is going to be really great because you can cycle, you can watch the cycle, and kind of plan your glacial spikes around when you're at your top of your Incanter's Flow, or your comet storms when you're at the peak of your Incanter's Flow. And there's a lot of there's a high skill ceiling when playing around Incanter's Flow, and I really like that. And on top of that, the Frost Mage is, even though you could consider our damage spiky with Glacial Spike, haha, what a pun. But this is the most consistent damage spec out of all the mage specs, and you got to think for Fire Mage you do insane damage every 2 minutes, and then for Arcane Mage you do insane damage every minute and 30 seconds, and then you're kind of in a rest phase unless you're on top of Rune of Power. But for Frost Mage, you're not really CD reliant, since it's on a 3-minute cooldown. Sure, your cooldowns are going to make you do a lot more damage, but when we have a 3-minute downtime on that, or 2 minutes and 40 seconds if you don't include the uptime that you have on Icy Veins, then this is probably the most consistent damage that you're going to have with all the mage specs. So Incanter's Flow is going to be what you're going to want to take there. Tier 60 is going to be Ebonbolt. I like Ebonbolt because it hits like a truck already, and then on top of that it gives you a guaranteed Brain Freeze proc. And if you haven't watched my single target video on Mage, I highly recommend it. I'll put a link in the description, and it'll explain why you want to have a Brain Freeze proc. But basically, just a quick summarize is that you don't want to cast Glacial Spike unless you have a Brain Freeze proc, ever, because it's not worth casting then, because you want that additional crit chance. And Ebonbolt will give you a guaranteed Flurry proc every 45 seconds, and that's nice because it's consistent. You know when it's going to happen, and if your Ebonbolt's off cooldown, and you get a Brain Freeze proc while you're getting to 5 stacks of your Icicle, then you can use those Brain Freeze procs, and then you use for extra damage, then use the Ebonbolt to guarantee the proc and all that jazz. Really like Ebonbolt. There's an argument for Frozen Touch that it gives you 20% more Brain Freezes and Fingers of Frost. That's nice. But I like the consistency of Ebonbolt, because it's like you're still rolling the dice, but your dice is a little loaded. But I far prefer in a class that's so RNG reliant with your Brain Freeze procs. I just like having something that is sturdy, always going to be there every 45 seconds, something you can rely on. Next tier is going to be Frigid Winds or Ice Ward. Ice Ward's nice because it gives you 2 stacks of your Frost Nova, and if you watch my video on single target, you'll know that you can use your Frozen Nova to freeze targets so you can get your Shatter passive. That's really nice because now you have 3 with your 2 Frost Novas and your Pet Freeze, and that can be super useful, especially when you're trying to shatter something, especially your Comet Storm. Frigid Winds is more likely the one you're going to want to take, though, especially if your tank relies on kiting a lot. And if you're doing high keys, then yeah, your tank's going to be kiting. And so Frigid Winds will increase your slows by an additional 15%. It just makes your tank's life much easier. So I'd say Ice Ward is more of a personal damage increase, and Frigid Winds is, more favorable for your overall group. And as a Frost Mage, your slow is a big utility. I wouldn't call it OP, definitely after the significant nerfs that it received, but it's still something that, I let me just say I tend to take Frigid Winds 90% of the time. Next tier is going to be Comet Storm or Splitting Ice. We'll talk about the difference between these two in the general tips. But Comet Storm is going to be your go-to, especially in low-level keys. On a 30-second cooldown, it's going to be basically up for every pack that you have. And that's really nice. In higher keys, if the trash pack lives longer than 30 seconds, Comet Storm is going to be ridiculous amounts of damage that you have. And I highly recommend taking it. This is what I take 90% of the time. Splitting Ice is interesting. And I'll explain why. So if you're pushing keys, and this happened to me as a personal experience, I started taking Splitting Ice over Comet Storm because it helped my overall damage. Because trash packs were living long, but not longer than 30 seconds. And so if you kind of think of the math, you're going to have burst AoE on a 30-second cooldown. So if the trash dies at 27 seconds, you are going to significantly fall behind because this is your main AoE damage dealer on top of your Frozen Orb. And then obviously your Blizzard, but that goes without saying. Splitting Ice is really nice because you get 100% like consistent cleave on your Ice Lances, your Glacial Spike, and your Ebon Bolts. And I'll talk a little bit later in the video about how we can use Splitting Ice and how you should be using it to really increase your damage. Freezing Rain's nice, but the numbers just don't compare to Splitting Ice or Comet Storm. And the last tier is always going to be Glacial Spike as of right now. Super useful. Love this spell. Probably my favorite spell out of all Frost Mage. It just hits like a truck. And, you can just... There's just that oomph, Like, you execute something with a Glacial Spike crit. It's just like, whoa, that was big dick damage. Hitting over 100k Glacial Spikes just feels so good. So let's get into secondary stats. As a general idea, you want to get close to 33% crit with your critical strike, but that doesn't mean that you should sacrifice your other secondary stats just so you can meet that threshold. If you're trying to do really big AoE, you can get a trinket like Tzane's Backspines, which increases your crit on a minute 30 cooldown. And that can be really nice because if I were to use this, it would take me close to that shatter cap of 33%. And if you're not sure what I'm talking about, like I said, go see that single target video where I go in depth and talk about it. You'll get to that 33% so that, like, for example, your Comet Storm will have a 100% crit chance when it goes down. So if you have like a massive pack, you could probably use this trinket. Let me explain a little bit. I don't do this because obviously you can't change your gear in Mythic Plus anymore like you could in Legion. If you could change your gear in Mythic Plus, I would highly recommend taking Tzane's Backspines because then for AoE you'd want to use that trinket. Because, having all of your Comet Storm bolts crit would be insane. But, if this is definitely an interesting trinket to have, but I highly recommend, having a haste one that's on like a 2 or 3 minute cooldown to, be in tandem with your Icy Veins, and then maybe like a passive one. I don't know. I usually go for highest item level for this one. Simming. You should sim your character for your trinkets. But there are other resources like Blood Mallet, which I use frequently, which will tell you how much DPS you'll gain from using a certain trinket over another one, and I'll link that in the description below. I use Blood Mallet almost every, not so much these days since we're kind of at the end of the raid tier, but in next raid tier I'm going to be looking at it almost daily. Now let's talk about the rest of our stats. Like I said, you don't want to sacrifice the rest of your secondary stats just for critical strike. You want to have high crit strike, but supplement it with haste, versatility, and mastery. Versatility as a whole is really good on mages, so you kind of want to have a little bit of versatility. Mastery will increase your glacial spike damage, so that's nice to have. And then haste obviously increases your attack speed and your spell casting. And so for Frost Mage, what I've found in my experience is that you can take pretty much the highest item level for each piece of gear that you have. Like, see, I'm taking like 390 here, 385, 395, 385, a super high item level items, because all of our secondary stats are good, and on top of intellect having a lot of value these days, especially early on in an expansion, the I just highly recommend taking highest item level. Obviously, take into consideration sockets and stuff, and then obviously you're not going to be doing that for your Azerite. You're going to be taking the Azerite pieces over that. So now that we've gone over that, we'll get into Azerite traits. Perfect segue. I like to take one Archive of the Titans with 2 Flash Freeze. I think you could probably take 3 Flash Freeze, but I don't own that at the moment. And so I like to go with a 390 Archive of the Titans and then Flash Freeze on my head and chest. Basically, whatever you can have. If you have Flash Freeze, you should take it. Now, what does Flash Freeze do? Each of your icicles deals 897 additional damage. When an icicle deals damage, you have a 5% chance to gain a Fingers of Frost effect. Only half of that matters since we're going to be since we take Glacial Spike. Right off the bat, you would say, well, Farragon, that doesn't make any sense because we don't use icicle damage because we take Glacial Spike, and you'd be very correct. That'd be an intelligent thought process. But icicle damage is your Glacial Spike damage. It directly translates. That's why your mastery, which is increases your Ice Lance damage, and that's why that translates to Glacial Spike. So basically, we're getting 897 multiplied by 5 additional damage to our Glacial Spike, and that's why I said earlier how we're going to be hitting like over 100k Glacial Spike procs or crits rather, and feels really good. This is the go-to. Flash Freeze is the go-to Azerite trait. It increases your damage by an unfathomable amount. Highly recommend picking it up. And that's basically it as far as the Azerite trait goes. So we'll get into general tips really quick. So obviously we're going to be wanting to be shattering the most important spells that we have. So Glacial Spike, Comet Storm, a little bit of Frozen Orb. And that's when, we would start thinking about taking Ice Ward. So we'd have additional shatter opportunities. So if we're going to be using our Comet Storm, I like to use my Pet Freeze because it's on a 25-second cooldown, and Comet Storm's on a 30-second cooldown, so they line up pretty nicely. So I use that, and it's also a ranged, so it's a ranged AoE stun, so I can use it anywhere within 40 yards of my pet. And it's super nice, and it's got a big AoE, so it keeps everything frozen. And if you'll watch what I do, basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to be casting Comet Storm, and I'm going to be holding my freeze for just a second so that the freeze happens just as the first comet hits the targets. That way I can get the most bang out of my buck, because if you don't play Frost or you're not familiar with CC, the more damage that they take, it reduces the time that they spend in the CC. So if you'll watch, I'll use my Comet Storm, I'll hold it, and then I'll freeze just before everything hits, and we'll do a buttload of damage. So highly recommend that you keep freeze and your Comet Storm on the same cooldown. Now if we're talking, we can also use our Frost Nova to crit our Glacial Spikes also. This won't work on bosses, but it will work on trash. So if you're within range of your Frost Nova, just spam that button immediately after you cast it. Unlucky, I didn't crit there, but you can shatter your Glacial Spike if you're within range of your Frost Nova like that. Let's see if I can get a big crit with my. There it is, 147k. Like, what the heck? That's insane damage. Another tip is that if you have Frozen Orb and there's a big pack, I would highly recommend walking up to the pack to dump your Frozen Orb, because if you do it from ranged, there's a chance. What it's gonna do is it's gonna stop at the first enemy that it hits, and in Mythic Plus, very rarely, unless you have a Death Knight tank, is the trash pack gonna be this tightly or this close together. So what you want to do is get as close as you can and kind of dump it in the middle. Oh, I've got the Honor Talon on. But you want to get as close as you can. If I turn this off really quick, you want to get as close as you can and just dump it in the middle. So that way it's making sure that it hits all of them. and that's a big AoE. And also you can freeze them to get these to crit. It won't last that long because you're going to be... Frozen Orb is doing a ton of damage, and on top of that you're going to be having two other allies, including your tank, not including your tank, doing AoE damage to it, so your freeze isn't going to last long. But that's something you need to think, is to be trying to shatter as many things as possible. And that's why I say Ice Ward is more of a selfish choice, I guess is what I'd call it, but it will increase your damage. Now, I kind of want to talk a little bit about splitting ice, and I fell into this when I was progressing keys. Excuse me. And basically what was happening is that, like I said, the trash wasn't dying, or was dying around 25 seconds, so I couldn't get 2 Comet Storms, so I was falling behind a lot in AoE. So I decided to start taking Splitting Ice just to try it. Now, a caveat here is that Comet Storm will be a greater single target, because if you're on strict single target, Splitting Ice is not going to do anything for you. But at least Comet Storm, you'll be able to do like a minimum 20k damage to the target on a 30-second cooldown. So keep that in mind. But as far as AoE, Splitting Ice was doing a lot more damage for me. Because, like I said, they were living longer than, or living not, excuse me, sorry. The trash was dying before my 30-second cooldown came up, and that's when Comet Storm really comes to power again. If the trash dies really quickly, Comet Storm is going to be your go-to. If trash dies, it takes a long time to die, but it takes less time than 30 seconds. You're going to want to take Splitting Ice, and that's because consistent cleave is going to increase your damage. Now, if you're also taking Splitting Ice, I highly recommend taking Ice Ward, because if you're taking, if you have Ice Ward or your freeze, now you have 3 chances to crit with a shatter. And you also have to remember that since we're not taking Comet Storm, our freeze can be used for our glacial spikes too. And this is where most of our AoE is going to come from. So I'm going to freeze it just before it hits, and it's going to crit for me there. And if we do it again with my Frost Nova, I'll be casting, and then I'll cast Frost Nova just before it finishes, and that's 200k just from a single cast. And we'll be able to do that several times. And, we'll keep up our Blizzard, we'll be putting our Frozen Orb down. And with Splitting Ice, your Icicles will also, or your instant cast Ice Lances will also be critting. And we'll get to our Glacial Spike, and then we'll Frost Nova again. Only 1 crit there, but you see how it goes. Like, it's a lot of AoE damage. But you also have to take into consideration that you can't control your Splitting Ice. You're always going to be cleaving. So on weeks like Bolstering, you're not going to want to take Splitting Ice because, there's going to be times where there's going to be a priority target. And you don't want to be cleaving onto other adds for no good reason. Because then the bolster's going to get out of control. But with Comet Storm, you have a lot more control over when you do AoE damage. And, there's going to be times where, you're just going to have to do less AoE damage and only single target one of the adds because, it's priority. But yeah, that's basically as much as I think I have to talk about for Frost Mage. I guess now we can get into macros. And I've got a couple macros that I use. I use the most macros on, excuse me. I use the most macros on Frost than I do other classes, or Fire and Arcane. So let's get into that. /M. So a couple things that I have is I did this for Flame Strike and Meteor in my Fire guides, but it's the same thing. It's a mouse over macro. You'll notice that when I cast Blizzard, I just have where my mouse is, and that'll be the center of where my Blizzard's going to be placed. And this is really useful because then you don't have to deal like in Mythic Plus. You want to squeeze out as much damage as possible, and it's a DPS loss if you're wasting time. Clicking the ability. Or clicking the ability, then choosing where you want to place it. Obviously, there's some spells where you want to be really accurate, like Ursol's Vertex as a druid, or what else? Like Efflorescence maybe as a druid, but that would rather click and be really quick. But yeah, I highly recommend getting into mouse over macros. I use them for basically any AoE ability that I have. So I have that for my Blizzard, and that's just easy enough. It's #show tooltip Blizzard, and that just makes sure when I hover over it, it tells me what the spell does, as opposed to just showing me nothing. And then it's /cast space bracket at cursor, close bracket, and then the spell you want to cast. Super easy macro. Very easy to perform or to write down, and it works really well. I also have one for my pet freeze. You'll notice right there, it does it immediately. That's super useful when it's like a couple seconds and like it's milliseconds where I want to use my freeze with my Comet Storm. And so I don't want to be clicking. I don't want to be, click, freeze, then drag it over, then use Comet Storm. It's a waste of time. So it's same thing, show tooltip, space freeze, cast at cursor, freeze. And then there's one that I highly recommend for Frost Mages in particular, or most pet classes. Pet UI is pretty dumb, not gonna lie. For some reason, I can't get the picture of the Frostbolt here, even though I do show tooltip. You'll see that it shows it, but I can't get the picture for some reason. I could probably go and search for it in here, but that's a lot of work that I don't feel like doing. So I just have the little auto attack animation, but it's hashtag show tooltip, so I hover over it, and then it's /petattack. And I'll put this one in the details below, just so you guys can copy and paste. But basically what it does is that if whenever I'm casting Frostbolt, it'll make sure that my pet is attacking the same target as me. So if I switch over here and start casting Frostbolt, it'll switch to this target. So that way it's super good for priority damage, so that your pet is always attacking the same thing you're attacking. And on top of that, if I'm not focused on anything, or I don't have anything targeted, and I hit one again, automatically puts my pet on passive. Or if the target that I was attacking dies, it'll automatically put my pet on passive. That way there won't be any ninja pulls. Frequently in freehold is a really good example. There's a lot of training dummies around, and if we're dumb in combat, for some reason pets will always just go over there and start attacking the training dummy that's closest. And then like if you're doing a boss fight and you don't realize that was happening, because you'll like look and you say, well, my water elemental is still doing water bolt damage. That doesn't make sense. Well, it's because your guy was attacking the training dummy and not the target that you wanted to be on. So highly recommend that macro. And yeah, I'll put that in the description below. And then last but not least is an ice block macro. Now, there's going to be times where, you have a deadly dot on you. Something that comes to mind is the dot that gets applied to you in the third boss of King's Rest. Super deadly, and if you can get that off of you by ice blocking using your immunity, that's going to be really helpful to your healer. And so, but on the flip side is that if you're using ice block normally, you're going to be in there for about a second before you can come out. Like, for example, just like this. Like, I'm spamming, and it just let me out, right? But I have a macro. Let me use Cold Snap really quick, and once my debuff goes away. But basically what it does is it lets me get in and out really quick. So let's look at what the code looks like. So here's my ice block macro. Basically it goes stop casting, stop casting, stop casting. So if I use this while I'm casting, it'll stop me casting, obviously. You have to do it a couple times or otherwise it doesn't work. I don't know, it's bizarre. But the most important part is /cancel aura ice block before it does use ice block. The way because it's coded like that, you have it'll try and get you out before it puts you in, and that way you can get in and out of ice block super easily. Now I have this on shift mouse button, and then my regular one on my mouse button, and that's because sometimes you're trying to spam ice block because it's on the GCD, and it's not always going to be there's going to be times where you're going to want to use the full duration of your ice block. Maybe you're going to be stuck in some dangerous AoE and you want to be, or say you're really low HP and you want to be healed up first. So you don't want to go in and out really quick. So I have it on my mouse button, and if there's going to be a time where I want to spam, like get in and out of my ice block really quick, I just hold shift and then the same mouse button. Highly recommend doing that. I found that it's super helpful. But yeah, I'll show you what it looks like with the macro. So like earlier, I'm going to be spamming my button, and you'll kind of see what it looks like as opposed to what it was before. So if I'm going, I'm in and out super quick. And that's one GCD, and so you're gonna have a super high uptime on your DPS. So that's it. If you guys have any questions, feel free to comment below. If you guys are interested, I got a lot of positive feedback on my my fire gameplay guide, as opposed to just the target dummy. It's a little different with Frost because fire revolves a lot around your combustion timings and working with your tank, whereas Frost Mage, you just kind of show up and do damage. So if you guys are interested in seeing a gameplay guide, I can do that. Obviously, it wouldn't be very difficult for me to put one together. But yeah, so just let me know if you're interested in that. I just don't think it's as necessary as fire, because I'm just gonna there's going to be times where obviously I'm going to want to use my icy veins because you got to think ahead. Well, are we going to be seeing the boss within the next 3 minutes? No. Well, then I'm going to use my icy veins. But with combustion, it's far more difficult than that because your damage revolves around that. But if you guys are interested in that and seeing a gameplay guide for Frost specifically, then let me know. And of course, I just want to plug my Twitch really quick. I'm not streaming as regularly these days because we full cleared. We just about full clear Mythic Uldir in 1 day. So I will stream that on Tuesdays. But other than that, I won't be streaming. I might be streaming if I'm doing keys or if I'm in like a silly heroic that I want to show my friends. You guys can tune in. But either way, that's going to be in the description below. But that's going to be at www.twitch.tv/Farragon14. And so if you guys want to catch me there, I'm not partnered, so you won't feel pressured to subscribe or anything like that. It's just if you guys want to show up, talk to me. I love answering questions in my Twitch, and I feel like I answer questions pretty quickly. And if there's something you want, maybe a more in-depth answer, like, hey, what do you think about this talent? I can give my thoughts on the process at the time, or I can show like a website where I can't really do that with here without getting, the or my video taken down. So hope you guys learned a little bit about Frost Mage, and I'll see you guys next time.